It had been one of those long, exhausting days that seemed to stretch endlessly, where every hour feels heavier than the last, and even the smallest tasks require more effort than they should. And by the time my shift finally ended at the warehouse on the edge of the city, my back ached from lifting boxes, my legs felt stiff from standing on concrete floors for nearly 10 hours, and my mind was so drained that I could barely focus on anything except the simple thought of getting home, eating something warm, and lying down without having to think about deadlines, supervisors, or the constant mechanical noise that filled the building all day. The quickest route to my apartment required me to walk through a large shopping mall, a bright and polished place filled with glass storefronts, shiny escalators, and artificial lighting that never seemed to dim no matter the time of day. And although I rarely stopped there because most of the stores sold things far beyond my budget, it was a convenient shortcut that saved me almost 20 minutes of walking, which mattered a lot on days when I felt as tired as I did that evening. As I entered the mall, I could immediately feel the contrast between my day and the environment around me, because people walked leisurely with shopping bags in their hands. Families chatted happily, teenagers laughed near the gaming arcade, and couples stood outside cafes deciding what to order, while I moved through the crowd quietly in my faded work uniform and dusty boots, feeling slightly invisible yet strangely out of place among the polished surfaces and bright advertisements. Near the center of the mall was a wide atrium with a decorative indoor fountain, surrounded by several long wooden benches, and as I approached that area, I felt a sudden wave of fatigue wash over me, so strongly that it almost made me dizzy. So without thinking too much about it, I walked to one of the benches and sat down slowly, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees, letting my muscles relax for the first time since early morning, while the soft sound of water flowing from the fountain created a calm background that felt almost therapeutic. At first, I simply sat there breathing deeply and stretching my back slightly, watching people pass by without really focusing on them, because all I wanted was to let my body recover for a few minutes before continuing home. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something as simple as sitting down could feel so relieving after a long day of physical labor. I must have been sitting there for about 15 minutes when I heard a sharp voice interrupt the quiet rhythm of the fountain, a voice that carried a tone of impatience even before I turned to look. And when I raised my head, I saw a middle-aged woman standing directly in front of me with her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her posture stiff, her expression stern, and her eyes scanning me in a way that immediately made me uncomfortable. She said, in a cold and clipped tone, that I had been sitting there for far too long and that the benches were not meant for people to just loiter without any purpose. And although her words surprised me, it was her tone that made my stomach tighten, because it carried an unmistakable sense of judgment, as though she had already decided something negative about me before even speaking. I responded politely, explaining that I had just finished a long work shift and was simply resting for a few minutes before heading home. But instead of softening her expression, my explanation seemed to irritate her further, and she looked me up and down slowly, her gaze lingering on my worn boots and dusty uniform as though they confirmed whatever assumption she had already made. She then stated firmly that the bench was meant for customers and shoppers, not for people who were just hanging around without buying anything. And her words felt like an accusation rather than a rule, because there were clearly other people sitting nearby who were doing exactly what I was doing, including a teenager scrolling through his phone, an elderly man reading a newspaper, and a woman holding several shopping bags while resting. When I pointed this out calmly, she dismissed it immediately by saying they were obviously shoppers while I did not look like one. And at that moment I felt a mix of embarrassment and frustration rise inside me, because her statement was not based on anything I had done, but entirely on how I appeared to her, which made me feel as though my presence itself was being treated as suspicious. I told her quietly but firmly that I had every right to sit on a public bench in a mall that was open to everyone, and that I was not causing any disturbance or bothering anyone. But she responded by saying she would call security if I refused to leave, and before I could even reply, she had already taken out her phone and stepped aside to make the call. As she spoke loudly into the phone, describing me as a suspicious individual who had been loitering and refusing to move, I felt the uncomfortable awareness of people nearby, beginning to watch the situation, some whispering quietly while others simply staring. And in that moment I considered standing up and leaving just to avoid the humiliation. But something inside me resisted the idea of walking away as though I had done something wrong when I knew I had not. Within a few minutes, the mall security guards approached, walking steadily toward us with serious but controlled expressions. And one of them asked me calmly what was going on, while the woman immediately began speaking over me, insisting that I had been sitting there for far too long and making people uncomfortable, even though no one had actually complained except her. I explained again that I had just finished work and needed to rest briefly before heading home. And although the guards seemed to understand, they still asked whether I had a reason to be in the mall, which, while likely routine, felt deeply humiliating because it implied that my presence required justification simply because of how I looked. Before the situation could calm down, the woman escalated things further by threatening to call the police if the guards did not remove me immediately. And despite their attempts to reassure her that such action was unnecessary, she dialed anyway, speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. When the police officers arrived, the atmosphere grew tense, because what had started as a simple misunderstanding now felt like a serious incident, and they asked me several questions, while requesting my identification, which I provided calmly despite feeling deeply embarrassed by the attention and the growing crowd of onlookers. After listening to both sides, one of the officers finally turned to the woman and stated clearly that I had not committed any crime and was fully within my rights to sit on a public bench. And when she continued to insist that I looked suspicious and did not belong there, the officer responded firmly that looking tired or out of place was not illegal. At that point, something unexpected happened, because several bystanders began speaking up in my defense, including the elderly man with the newspaper who confirmed that I had simply been sitting quietly, the teenager who pointed out that many people rested there, and the woman with shopping bags who stated gently that I had not bothered anyone at all. Hearing others support me shifted the entire tone of the situation, and the woman who had called the police suddenly seemed less confident, muttering that she had only been trying to be careful, while the officers politely but firmly explained that there was a difference between genuine concern and unnecessary accusations based on assumptions. After returning my identification, one of the officers apologized quietly for the inconvenience and told me I was free to stay as long as I wished, and although I thanked him, the sense of peace I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a lingering discomfort that made the bench feel less like a place of rest and more like a stage where I had been publicly judged. I remained seated for a few more minutes, trying to regain my composure while the crowd slowly dispersed and normal mall activity resumed. But the experience stayed with me long after I finally stood up and continued walking home, because it forced me to confront how easily a simple act like resting on a bench could be misinterpreted when filtered through someone else's biases. As I walked through the evening streets toward my apartment, I realized that the incident was never really about the bench itself, but about how quickly people can decide who belongs in a space and who does not, based solely on appearance, clothing, or perceived social status, and how fragile dignity can feel when it depends not only on one's actions, but also on the judgments of strangers who may never take the time to understand the full story behind what they see.